Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci infiniment d'être ici. C'est un programme auquel on tient particulièrement, LX Paris Photo, que nous avons créé il y a 5 ans en partenariat étroit avec le ministère de la Culture. Je vous présente Fanny Escoulène, chef du département photographie au ministère de la Culture, et Agnès Saal, haut fonctionnaire diversité et égalité. On a un programme important cet après-midi, donc Fanny, je te passe la main. Juste 2 chiffres. Quand on a démarré le programme il y a 5 ans, seulement 20% des artistes représentés sur la foire étaient des femmes. Aujourd'hui, elles sont de 36%. Donc, on avance. C'est quand même plus 72% en 5 ans.
Mais pour paraphraser ma ministre, ce n'est pas assez. Merci, bonjour aussi surtout, et merci d'être avec nous. Simplement pour commencer cet après-midi, j'avais envie avec Agnès de vous faire un petit flashback. On est en 2018, c'est la première année du programme LX Paris Photo. À l'époque, j'ai été la première commissaire de ce parcours et je remercie encore Florence Bourgeois de m'avoir accordé cette confiance et bien sûr le ministère de la Culture à l'époque. Et dans le cadre du parcours, j'avais construit un programme de conférences et j'avais invité Marie Daucher, qui à l'époque avait interpellé le directeur du plus grand festival de photographie au monde dans une tribune dans le journal Libération avec le collectif La Part des Femmes qui s'interrogeait de savoir pourquoi si peu de femmes étaient exposées à l'époque dans ce festival. On avait invité La Part des Femmes à prendre la parole sur scène et j'avais envie de vous faire ce petit mémo pour ceux et celles qui ne l'avaient pas vu. C'était un moment assez émouvant et surtout de se dire aujourd'hui que les choses ont bien progressé et on en parlera évidemment plus avant cet après-midi. Et à 17h avec les commissaires, les 5 commissaires du parcours LX Paris Photo, nous reviendrons sur cette évolution. Et voilà, après la vidéo, je laisserai la parole à Agnès. Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Marie Daucher, je suis photographe.
Elina Broteros, valokuvaaja. Elina Broteros, photographer.
Karen Knorr, photographer. Karin Knorr, photographe.
Corinne Mercadier, photographe.
Carole Benita, photographe.
Scarlett Cotten, photographe.
Hélène Jaillet, photographe.
Malal Andria Lamidrazana, photographe.
Wiham Haddad, photographe.
Tahmina Monzavi, Akos.
Lineska, photographe.
Agnieszka Reis, photographe.
Leila Adjovi, photographe.
Nous sommes photographes, toutes. Regardez-nous. Prenez votre temps. Nous sommes en réalité très nombreuses. Autodidactes pour certaines, pour d'autres formées dans les meilleures écoles d'art où nous représentons 60%, parfois plus, de diplômés. Pourtant, notre part dépasse à peine 20% des artistes exposés en France et dans d'autres pays occidentaux. 20%. L'histoire de la photographie est souvent invoquée pour justifier notre absence des collections et des simèses. Mais quelle histoire! Les femmes se sont emparées du médium depuis ses origines et se sont illustrées dans tous les domaines, de la photo scientifique au reportage de guerre. Elles ont pu en tirer, en leur temps, gloire et argent. Hélas, leur existence a été en grande partie effacée de l'histoire et des mémoires par la persistance d'un mythe tout-puissant, celui du génie créateur d'essence exclusivement masculine. Regardez-nous. Prenez votre temps.
Vous-même, vous pensez que ni le sexe, ni la couleur, ni la condition sociale des artistes ne motivent vos choix, que seule la qualité compte. Mais savez-vous que plus de 80% des photographies sélectionnées ou achetées sont l'œuvre d'hommes occidentaux ? Le talent serait donc si mal partagé ? En réalité, ce talent-là dont il est question n'est qu'une norme qui limite la liberté de choix et la liberté de création. Il est ardu, le chemin que doit parcourir le dossier artistique d'une femme avant d'arriver sur le bureau d'un décideur, bien plus que pour ses confrères. Bien sûr, il y a une culture de l'entre-soi masculin, mais pas seulement. Que se passe-t-il quand votre poitrine attire plus le regard que vos images? Et à combien se réduisent vos chances après avoir osé refuser les avances d'un éditeur, d'un galeriste ou d'un mécène, et ce, indépendamment de la qualité de votre travail? Un autre obstacle majeur, c'est le défaut de prise de conscience et le manque d'engagement des institutions, de responsables de festivals, d'acheteurs, ceux-là même qui laissent les femmes sur le bas-côté, les cantonnent aux sections découvertes et les oublient après s'être targués de les avoir révélées. Comment se fait-il que seulement 10% des prix concernés dans le monde de l'art reviennent à des femmes ? Si nous vivons toutes le sexisme, certaines d'entre nous vivent aussi le racisme. Elles sont encore moins visibles, encore plus marginalisées et encore plus instrumentalisées. Mais pourtant, dans ces marges, un art bouillonne et se questionne et se renouvelle. Regardez-nous. Prenez votre temps. Regardez-nous.
Les milieux de l'art et de la photographie reflètent le fonctionnement inégalitaire de nos sociétés. Ce qu'ils ne reflètent pas, c'est la richesse, la complexité, la diversité des pratiques des créations actuelles. Et de fait, c'est aussi d'une vision du monde plus ouverte et plus diverse dont sont privés les publics. Quant aux conséquences pour nous, les femmes, elles sont immenses. Nos capacités de création et de production sont faibles. Notre manque de visibilité ruine nos carrières. Nous ne représentons que 20% des artistes aidés par des fonds publics. 20%. Regardez-nous. Prenez votre temps. Il faut en finir avec ce déni. Malgré toutes les études, les colloques, les revendications, rien ne change dans la photo, rien ne bouge dans les mondes de l'art sans politique publique volontariste. Face à des décennies de surdité, de silence imposé, d'insultes, de dénigrement, de manque de moyens, nous en avons assez et nous parlons égalité des chances. Nous pensons parité, nous exigeons le partage équitable des ressources publiques. Non, l'égalité ne se conjugue pas avec un manque de talent ou uniformité. L'égalité n'est pas l'aliénation de votre libre arbitre, pas plus qu'elle n'est synonyme d'illégitimité des femmes. En revanche, il s'agit bel et bien de mettre fin à la confiscation des moyens symboliques, institutionnels et financiers par une minorité souvent aveugle à ses privilèges.
Non, l'exigence de parité n'est pas synonyme d'un enfer féministe et totalitaire. Pour beaucoup d'entre vous, il s'agit seulement de sélectionner 10 à 25 femmes par an dans vos programmes. 10 à 25. Nous sommes certaines que les responsables du milieu de la photographie sont capables de faire des choix plus éclairés. Alors j'entends déjà venir les questions. Allons-nous déclencher une nouvelle guerre des sexes ? Bien sûr que non. Nous allons seulement réclamer notre part, tout en pointant un prodigieux déséquilibre et montrer l'urgente nécessité de le résorber. Écoutez-nous, il est temps.
Pour comprendre ce que sont le sexisme et le racisme, leurs conséquences et leurs mécanismes, il est indispensable de s'informer, de lire, d'entendre les personnes concernées, de les rencontrer. Quand des commissaires doivent répondre à l'obligation d'inclure plus de femmes dans une exposition, elles et ils en ressortent riches de nouveaux savoirs, de découvertes, d'envie de partager et de transmettre ces pans entiers de la photographie. Toujours. De cette contrainte naît la créativité et l'ingéniosité. C'est la raison d'être de la feuille de route pour l'égalité femmes-hommes du ministère de la Culture français, à laquelle ont contribué de nombreux artistes devenus militantes par nécessité. Dans un monde idéal, ni objectifs chiffrés ni sanctions financières ne seraient nécessaires et nous serions toutes en train de travailler ou de discuter avec nous, vous, de nos prochaines expositions. Hélas, nous en sommes loin, très très loin. Écoutez-nous, prenez votre temps.
Prenez votre temps. L'inégalité première, c'est l'inégalité entre les hommes et les femmes. Et là, ce n'est même pas l'inégalité en tant que telle que nous réclamons, mais un bouleversement des rapports dans une société étouffée par des normes invisibles. Vous pensez que les choses changent progressivement, que nous devrions juste attendre, être patientes. Mais non, les choses ne changent pas d'elles-mêmes. C'est à nous, nous tous et nous toutes, de les faire bouger et de sortir enfin de nos zones de confort.
C'est pourquoi nous en appelons à tous les responsables d'institutions, de festivals, de maisons d'édition, de galeries. Soyez les acteurs et les actrices d'une nouvelle expansion de la photographie. Aimez la photographie autant que nous l'aimons, nous qui continuons malgré une si faible visibilité. Exposez, achetez, collectionnez les travaux des femmes. Nous sommes à un moment déterminant de notre histoire. Allez-vous être avec nous? Osez. Osons.
Ce rappel, vous en conviendrez, est particulièrement émouvant pour celles, pour ceux qui ont, tout au long de ces 5 années, œuvré à faire en sorte de traduire cette urgente, impérieuse nécessité de l'égalité. Et en effet, Marie a raison, sans volonté politique, sans ardeur à agir, rien n'est possible. Or, cette volonté politique, nous avons eu la chance de la rencontrer, de l'incarner et de la traduire dans les faits. Ce qui explique que, en 2023, 5 années plus tard, nous n'en sommes plus du tout au même degré d'inégalité, sans dire pour autant que le chemin est abouti, mais pour autant, nous avons progressé. Florence a donné à l'instant quelques chiffres particulièrement édifiants sur la présence des femmes au sein de Paris Photo, et le pourcentage atteint, 36% aujourd'hui, même s'il n'est pas encore équivalent à la parité, 50-50, marque malgré tout un progrès considérable par rapport aux quelques 20 et quelques pourcents, voilà encore 5 ou 6 ans. Je rappelle à cet égard qu'un livre magnifique vient de paraître aux éditions textuelles qui rappelle les 5 années de parcours, elle, à Paris Photo, et qui donne la parole aux femmes photographes qui ont incarné ce mouvement vers l'égalité au sein de Paris Photo. Je vais vous donner quelques chiffres qui vont peut-être mieux traduire que tous les discours la réalité de la situation aujourd'hui en la comparant à celle dans laquelle nous nous trouvions voilà 5 ans. Avec quelques rubriques phares, les acquisitions, les prix, les lieux, les festivals, la profession. Les acquisitions d'abord. En 2019, les acquisitions des collections publiques consacrées aux artistes femmes ne représentaient que 29% du total des acquisitions. En 2023, le pourcentage atteint 39%. Pas encore la parité, mais un progrès sensible. Les prix. En 2019, les femmes ne représentaient que 28% des lauréates des prix dédiés à la photographie. En 2022, on n'a pas encore complètement terminé l'année 2023, en 2022, 40% des prix photo ont été attribués à des femmes. Et elles le valent bien. Les lieux. En 2019, la part des femmes exposées dans des lieux dédiés à la photographie ne représentait que 34%. En 2022, cette même part est passée à 52%. Rendez-vous compte, nous avons même dépassé 50%. Les festivals. En 2019, la part des femmes exposées dans les festivals de photographie était de 31,5%. En 2022, cette même part est passée à 53%. C'est donc possible, ils l'ont fait. La profession, rappelez quand même que dans les études supérieures en photographie, les étudiantes sont et restent majoritaires. Et dans les professions, en 2020, seulement 37% des photographes étaient des femmes, alors même qu'elles sont près de 60% dans les écoles de photographie. Nous avons enregistré un progrès qui reste encore à parfaire. Pourquoi ? Parce que nous, et Fanny va en parler, nous enregistrons une déperdition de la part des femmes œuvrant dans le secteur de la photographie, donc en tant que métier, à mesure que l'on avance en âge, et au-delà de 40%, cette part devient plus faible
Et cette évaporation, évidemment, nous pose un problème majeur. Donc, dire en 2 mots que nous avons progressé parce qu'il y a eu une volonté politique, que le chemin n'est pas encore terminé, que nous avons encore beaucoup à faire, mais que nous avons, je crois, fait la preuve, d'une part, que ces progrès étaient réalisables, qu'ils étaient possibles et qu'ils ont été réalisés sans rien céder à la qualité et à l'exigence artistique qui, évidemment, restent des maîtres mots en matière de photographie.
Merci Agnès. Vous dire 2 choses. On tient énormément à ce programme LX Paris Photo que l'on a construit avec toute la bienveillance de Paris Photo évidemment et de Kering qui soutient ce programme également depuis 2019. Qu'on souhaite le poursuivre et qu'à partir de l'année prochaine, alors que la foire trouvera une nouvelle place beaucoup plus grande dans le Grand Palais rénové, on poursuivra LX Paris Photo sous une autre forme. Qu'on est en train de définir, mais voilà, donc on ne quitte pas le programme, on le remodèlera. Et l'autre chose, c'est qu'on a eu la grande chance de pouvoir construire cette année un nouveau programme que la ministre a annoncé et qu'elle porte avec une grande bienveillance, qui s'appelle Elle et Cité, que l'on a construit en partenariat avec la Cité internationale des arts. Et je remercie vraiment Bénédicte Alliot, sa directrice, d'avoir été à l'écoute de cette proposition et de nous avoir accueillis aussi avec une grande bienveillance, parce que c'était important d'offrir des espaces de travail, de résidence à des femmes photographes, comme le disait Agnès, qui arrivent en milieu de carrière et on sait que c'est plus difficile pour elles, pour les raisons qu'on connaît, dans ce décrochage-là de moment de la maternité, de renouer parfois avec le milieu professionnel et d'avoir un espace à elles pour travailler et pour faire de la recherche. Donc nous avons inventé ces résidences avec le soutien aussi de la Fondation Neuflis OBC. Je remercie Caroline Stein de sa fidélité et de sa confiance, ainsi que l'ADAGP qui nous a rejoints aussi sur ce programme. Et je remercie évidemment Marianne Ferrifal et Johanna Agege qui est ici avec nous d'avoir accepté aussi de nous soutenir. C'est un programme ambitieux qui accueillera 6 photographes en résidence à la Cité l'année prochaine, 3 résidentes puis 3 résidentes. Donc ce sont des résidences de 3 mois. Elles ont une allocation de vie de 2 000 €. Elles ont un accompagnement par un mentor et elles ont une petite bourse de production. Voilà, toutes les conditions que l'on espère réunies pour faire de ce temps de travail un véritable moment aussi pour elles de réflexion et de réseau. Et donc pour ces questions-là, on a aussi souhaité que ces résidences s'adressent à des femmes qui ne vivent pas à Paris ou en Île-de-France, qui sont souvent éloignées justement des réseaux professionnels et qui peuvent avoir du mal à les connecter. Donc ce sont des résidences pour des femmes photographes qui vivent hors Île-de-France. Donc on a réuni notre jury il y a quelques jours. Agnès, tu y étais. Je remercie Sandrine Hérol de mon équipe qui s'occupe de la création photographique d'avoir aussi participé au jury. Je vais d'abord donc mentionner le jury qui a accompagné cette résidence. Donc Audrey Oaro, directrice du Centre régional de la photographie des Hauts-de-France, Damary Samao, historienne de la photographie attachée de conservation au Centre Pompidou, donc Agnès, Sandrine, je vous ai cité, Katia Camelli, qui est une artiste représentante de la DAGP, Caroline Stein et Bénédicte Alliot. Il me manque aussi une personne de la DAGP, il me semble, c'était Marine, elle n'est pas dans ma liste. Voilà, je remercie encore nos partenaires d'avoir apporté leur confiance sur ce programme. Et juste pour finir, et j'annoncerai les 6 lauréates, puisqu'elles n'ont pas été encore officiellement annoncées, donc je le fais aujourd'hui, et je sais que c'est un moment attendu aussi pour elles. Et je leur demanderai de nous rejoindre pour celles qui sont ici, ainsi que les partenaires, si vous voulez bien qu'on fasse une photo de famille. Donc, les lauréates du programme Elle est citée 2024 sont Catherine Cataruzza, Marion Grenier, Andrea Vamos, Élise Fitt-Duval, Alexandra Pouzet et Anna Filipova. Bravo à elles. Voilà, je ne sais pas si elles sont par là, je vous invite à nous rejoindre et on fait une petite photo de famille.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous à nouveau. Je vais juste vous présenter Fiona Rogers, qui est la 5e commissaire du programme LX Paris Photo, qui a donc dessiné un parcours sur la foire et qui s'occupe de cet après-midi de conversation. Fiona est commissaire au V&A for Curator for Women Photography at the Parasol Foundation at the VNA. Voilà, donc je vous laisse entre ses mains pour 3 conversations passionnantes cet après-midi.
Merci, Florence. Bonjour. I'm going to speak in English because my French is really horrible. So yes, my name is Fiona Rogers. I am the VNA Parasol Foundation Curator of Women in Photography. And I'm also this year's L Curator, LX Paris Photo. So I wanted to say a huge thanks to Florence and Anna for inviting me, and a big thanks to Keyring Women in Motion and to the Ministry of Culture for this continued and sustained commitment to supporting women artists. Absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to host these talks this afternoon. We're going to have this one now about collage practice, and then we have another one at 3:30 called Acts of Resistance with 3 amazing artists, Hoda Afshar, Yelena Yemchuk, and Miriam Balous. And then at 5 we have the celebration of the LX Paris Photo anniversary book. And then we have a wonderful keynote at 6:30 chaired by Mark Seeley from Autograph with Dr. Deb Willis. So I really hope you'll come back and see some of those. But I'm going to hand over to Renee. So Renee Masai is a curator, historian, scholar, academic, and all-round wonderful woman. And she is joined today by Tara Krynak, Justine Kurland, and Keisha Scalville. So I'm going to hand over to Renee.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fiona, for this wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and especially a pleasure and a privilege again to be sharing the stage with 3 brilliant, creative, visual, and otherwise thinkers. So thank you very much for being here. And thank you all in the audience. Join us. My gratitude to Paris Photo and to Elle, of course, for making this possible. This panel is on collage, visual pleasure, liberation, and survival. And I'm going to highlight the word visual pleasure. I would like us to hold on to that notion as we sit here for the next hour and just embrace the idea of pleasure in the act of art making, pleasure in disrupting, pleasure in being, pleasure in just opening up spaces, pleasure in speculating, and just to think together, think with images, be with images, rather than about. And the idea of creating a space where we can have that pleasure for ourselves, where we can claim those spaces, is really what I'd like us to reflect on together. And of course, to think about photography as an often rebellious and disobedient mode of being, and its relationship to collage in particular. So the idea of visual disobedience together with pleasure, I think, is really important for us to hold on to as well. To me, the idea of collaging is really about expansion. It's an expansive praxis, transmuting, transactional, transgressive, and that's what I think about when I look at your work. In particular, I think of stay better. Apologies. I'm going to be very close to the mic and won't move. Okay. I hope everybody heard the bit about visual pleasure, so I won't say it again, but I could say it another 3 times. Okay. So collaging also as a triple act of resistance, insistence, subversion, an act of refusal, all of those notions will come up in your presentations, I believe, and in our conversation after. To me, it's also the idea of a promise. So there's a kind of threat and a promise in the work, and I'd like us to think about that as well. And in all of your work, I feel that those sentiments manifest as a kind of radical material, emotional, personal, political, shape-shifting possibility of what we can do with the medium. And this becomes evident as both a feminist, activist, diasporic mode of being, thinking, and sensing. I would like to think about the potential about creating different languages, different visual vernaculars, about the disobedient, remedial, reparative qualities of collaging, and simply the idea also of ignoring certain modes of being and working that we can break apart through these acts of collaging, as a kind of undoing and doing at the same time. What I haven't done here is, I can't see it moving. Not changing. So, we're going to begin with your work, Tara. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. You currently have a solo exhibition at Haute in Amsterdam. Congratulations on that. I would like to say that I've had the great pleasure of first encountering your work at the Krasner Kraus Photography Awards a year ago. And I was so incredibly touched by the extraordinary, exquisite artist book that you produced, El Jardin. And
Thank you.
Yeah, it stayed with me, and I was just unbelievably changed, really, by the profound mediation on belonging and home, and the way that you brought these archival and personal modes together. So thank you so much for doing that. I'll hand over to you, and of course your biography is on the website, so I won't do those kinds of introductions. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Renee, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you to Fiona and Keisha and Justine for sharing space. Thank you so much. I'm going to move to
Apologies, slight technical, not working very well. Do bear with us. It's also so incredibly loud in here, so I'm finding it quite hard to focus.
Yes.
Maybe whilst this is happening, perhaps we could there is another wonderful interconnectivity here, because all of you have worked together, of course.
Yes.
And maybe whilst this is being sorted, we could talk about the way that your work has been brought together through collaboration, through curatorial work. Justine, you curated a fabulous exhibition called The Rose that brought both of their work together. Would you perhaps say a few words on that whilst we...
Yes.
Slight change of plan.
Yeah. No, thank you, Renee, for that amazing introduction. I feel really excited to be on this panel because in July, I curated a show with both Tara and Keisha, which I'm actually going to talk about a little bit in my presentation. But this idea of survival and visual pleasure and liberation is so inspiring, and it opens up space, and it allows photography to continue. And this is only my second time at Paris Photo, and I've noticed just in 1 year, there's a huge change in the demographics of who is shown and who is represented on the walls. And just in 1 year, that change is really inspiring, is really amazing. I know it's Keisha's first time. What's your take on being here?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, this is my first year here, and actually, I just did a quick walk around before I got here. But I wanted to kind of come back to the show and just talk about the show that you curated, titled "The Rose," and it was just a beautiful. It was a beautiful experience in terms of sharing space with a variety of generations of artists who are all thinking about ways in which to kind of push against how the body, how our existence is being represented, and opening up new spaces in that, and thinking about collage not just as an act of cutting and pasting, but an act of liberating the image. So there was something about that I found really beautiful in terms of being in that space.
Like it gave me a new way to think about my work. So, and then to be in conversation, direct dialogue with all of these amazing women at the show, and to actually come together and meet everyone was really amazing. I believe the slides, are they working now? Okay. I'm jumping right in because I see collage as really closely related to the strategies that I use across my practice. So what I've done is I've chosen recent work across multiple bodies of work in which I'm using my body both in front of the camera and behind the camera. And in these works, I use reenactments and rephotography, and these acts lead to a kind of rewriting of the historical canon. And as you see here in my Weston work, I'm writing myself into the canon. And later you'll see a kind of inversion to that. I've included slides where I'm using erasure and redaction as a kind of subversion to that. So when Renee describes collage as this kind of double acts of resistance, insistence I see as related to reenactment, and subversion I see as related to erasure and redaction. Next slide. Can they do the next slide? Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So this is a performance I did called 1979 Contact Negatives. And I made these portfolio of cyanotypes in a long duration performance. One important, we talked a little bit about lived experience as well in the introduction to this, and I think all of us work from this idea of photography being related to lived experience. We make work from lived experience. So one important biographical detail that's important to understanding this particular project is the use of my body throughout, and the use of my body throughout my work is my identity as an indigenous transracial adoptee. And I was born in Peru, in Lima, in 1979, and it was during a very tumultuous period in Peru's history. I was displaced from my biological family and left in an orphanage, and then eventually adopted by white parents and raised in the US Midwest with other Black and indigenous siblings. And that's a really important point in all of my work. I think I'm always coming from this idea of orphanhood and trying to fit my body into all of these different histories. So in this particular body of work, which is a really small portion of a much larger series that I dedicated about 12 years to working on the book and writing, but in this performance, I'm projecting appropriated images from political and pornographic magazines from Lima, Peru, and then projecting them over my body as a way to kind of imagine the ways in which larger historical narratives and trauma might actually be held in the body. So next slide. This is just so you could see what is happening in the performance is all of these images from multiple projectors are being projected over my body, and then the resulting cyanotype is on the right. And I'm using a large format camera, and I'm developing everything on site, printing in the gallery so people could come and see the process. Next slide. Thank you. So my early life circumstances, I think, represent generations of socioeconomic inequality, corruption, and instability, not just in Peru, but across the Americas. I think this body of work is really about the ongoing legacy of colonial power structures that erase, exterminate, and appropriate indigenous bodies and culture. Next slide. This series is being exhibited here with Thomas Sander Gallery, and it's called Repose. And again, Repose, I'm using my body to write myself into history. It's a performance that incorporates an on-site darkroom, a lighting studio, and installation of Xeroxed images. And I'm thinking about the woman's pose, and I source these women's poses from my own personal collection and from site-specific archival research. So they come from fashion, vintage pornographic magazines, artist monographs, art history books, museum catalogs, and anthropological studies, and they span centuries and continents. Next slide. So over the course of these live performances, I choose poses, or audiences can come and choose a pose for me. And then what I do is I use my own body to re-perform the pose, and I slowly produce these new self-portraits in real time. And the resulting portraits form what I think of as a new typology of women's poses. And next slide. This is a body of work that I think is really closely related to this repose work. And I'm showing this body of work alongside the new work because this is work I made right out of graduate school, and it's just to show how I've been using my body for 20 years and thinking about the same issues, and this act of repetition and this idea of re-presencing, I think reenacting the past in the present in a repetitive way, to write myself into history, to think about how my body fits or doesn't fit. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap it up here, but I wanted to show this body of work because I think it's really important. It's called Erasing Moonrise, and it's part of this Master Rituals series that I started. I started with Ansel Adams, and so this is a performance I did where I'm erasing 3 photographs of Moonrise, one of his most famous photographs. And next slide. I used my hair to erase the image, but what I was really, can you go to the book slide, the previous, yes, this one, thank you. So I'm showing this because this is my personal kind of way of working. So I have this Ansel Adams book that I've been working with since 2017, and what I do is I'm looking, this is Ansel's sort of looking back at his career, picked out 40 of his best photographs and tells the story of his photograph. And what I'm doing is redacting and using erasure as a strategy to find my own history, my own voice within these words. They're ridiculously technical. They're really boring text, actually. But what I'm trying to do is find the poetic language in that technical language. So I think what I'm going to do is just end with one of the poems that I wrote from Ansel's text. It's called Black Sun. Black sun, concentration of spirit, planned mind on image. I confess I wandered into conjecture, possible experiments. Things work. I confess I wandered into conjecture, possible experiments. The sun flared into urgent need, the sky the center of the flare, completion. I am working my way into the sun's image. This happened, my second exposure, the black sun, a photograph about proof. I then recalled negative densities, decrease realization. To end, my practice, as I said, thinking about reenactment and redaction as these 2 kind of ways of resistance. And in this project, I'm going to end with, I'm reenacting Ana Mendieta's gesture, ritual gesture of making her body tracks work. And as I'm making these, re-performing these repetitive gestures, I'm then making a cyanotype that records this repetitive gesture. So this is a piece that I've been working on that is ongoing, and it's part of a larger installation. And they are ritual performances that I do in a kind of offering to Ana Mendieta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara, for this beautiful to see these works. Thank you. I love the idea of a negative density as well, and the way you were just speaking in the poem at the end. And I think there is a wonderful movement to Justine, because Justine, you have also written about Tara's work, and you wrote something very wonderful about Tara restaging her own birth in the essay that you wrote in Repose. And there was another line in there about willing herself into being and out of the archive, and this kind of dancing with other images and into space. So I think, again, this speaks about the generosity between practitioners and the way that I think all of you work through a lens of care and generosity. So I wanted to do that as a kind of bridge, but then also the way that you engage with books and that sense of erasure and reduction also, again, speaks to how you work, of course, with books, with your project Scum Manifesto. I could do a longer introduction, but because we're running slightly late on time, I think I'm just going to pass over to you, but I want to say one thing, just about the way that you create these defiant spaces through a kind of destruction of something, but a birthing of something else. And I think, again, you have a beautiful bridge there. Yeah. So that sense of birthing, undoing, doing, and over to you.
No, thank you, Renee. I definitely see myself or can know my practice by knowing other artists, and I'm so happy to be holding space with these two incredible artists and this amazing curator. So yeah, I actually wanted to try an experiment. I'm going to read something that's on the screen, and I'm going to invite everyone here to read along with me so that you can join your voice together with my voice. Because I think that that's the whole point of making art, is that we join together. So please follow along on the screen. I, Justine Kurland, am scum. I thrive in the stagnant waste of your self-congratulatory, boring photography. I bubble up a raw life force, multiplying from the useless excrement of your misogynistic books. I worm in the fleshy folds of your fetid library, laying a larva to feed on the crumbling quid pro quo circle jerk ideology. Your time is over, officer historian. I call for the graphic end of the graphic representation of the male canon, its daddy worship, and its monopoly on meaning and value. The canon is every dick shoved against some woman's back on a crowded train. I see you there in your fat 10-year chair, oogling freshman girls with a rapey smile. I'm coming for you with a blade.
All right.
No, thank you. Thank you for...
That felt really good, Justine.
Next slide. SCUM with a silent B stands for the Society of Cutting Up Men's Books. It's an homage to Valerie Solanas' 1967 feminist text, SCUM Manifesto, which called for the destruction of the male sex, the power that seeks domination and death, and the creation of a superior all-female society. Next slide. Last year, this piece was selected for LX, and my artist statement was supposed to be published in a catalog. But when I submitted the manifesto we just read, they refused to publish it. Rather than modifying my statement, I withdrew from the selection. Next slide. I started this body of work with the destruction of my personal library, hundreds of canonized white men photographers, men who have taken up too much room physically and literally, men my education indoctrinated into me, whose photographic conventions became the basis of my own visual language. I've turned their books into collages. Here, for instance, my Yale professor, Todd Papageorge. Next slide. Each, I love that, yeah. Each collage I make is a reclamation of history, a dismemberment of the patriarchy, a gender inversion in the usual terms of possessions, and a modest attempt to offset a life of income disparity. Next slide. I know exactly what I want to cut from each book. Often the urge is about freeing or protecting a woman's body, but sometimes I'm drawn to other subjects or simply responding to form, color, and light. Next slide. I taught myself how to knit shapes, cutting line and color. I plotted grids along moving coordinates. I constructed totemic and vaginal forms. Next slide. Oh, wait. The slides haven't been moving. I just keep saying next slide. Oh, keep going, keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Yeah, here, we're here. And I spelled out my name. This is a Lee Friedlander nude that I spelled out my name as an investigation of the aesthetic quality of ownership. Okay, we're caught up. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. My second largest collage to date is made from multiple copies of Lee Friedlander's nude, which I acquired by posting on Instagram. I offered to upgrade anyone who sent nudes to me with a copy of Scum Manifesto. The resulting collages are homages to Jay DeFeo's monumental painting The Rose and what Audre Lorde calls the uses of the erotic, a meditation on female visual pleasure, which I think we're going to talk about. Next slide. And so this is a installation shot of the rose that I also called it after the Jay DeFeo painting that we were speaking about. So the rose is also the name of the group show I curated at the Lumber Room in Portland, Oregon, including Tara and Keisha, thinking about collage outside the masculinist mythology. Bringing together artists who focus on the intelligence of the cut and the emotional repair of the glue to build a livable world together. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine.
I'm gonna get thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for this, and thank you also for the collective bringing us all together with the voicing of, I was going to say that wonderful threat and promise is one of the best lines on the cover of a book that I've seen, that I'm coming for you with a blade. Yeah, that's just a brilliant opening. Speaking about books, Keisha Scarville's new artist book is part of the selection for the Aperture Paris Photo. And collaging it upside down, creating new imagery. It's part of the book selection on display, so do have a look at it. It's a wonderful, wonderful artist book, absolutely exquisite. I love how it brings the kind of like hybrid, creolized core of your practice together. You know, very rarely to me, an artist book object looks like the artist practice and really embodies that. So huge congratulations on that, Keisha. It was a real pleasure to be encountering that book there and spending so much time with it. I wanted to say something about and actually quote you briefly. You speak so beautifully about the elusive body and that sense of latency in your practice. And I wonder whether maybe we can bring that out a little bit in your presentation as well. And the way that in your passport photos, there is a real kind of sense of amplification, transmutation, elevation, and that wonderful sense of metamorphosis that happens in collaging. So I think your work really, truly embodies that, just in a very exquisite way. So over to you, Keisha. Pleasure to
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee. I'm just having a really happy moment right now, sharing this stage with you guys. And thank you both for really beautiful presentations. The way in which I engage collage, or the way in which I first engaged collage was through my father's first passport photo. And this was an image I took of my dad. My parents immigrated to the States in 1967, 1968. My dad first came here in 1967. And back in about 2012, I was doing a project where I was interviewing both my parents because it was almost coming up on 50 years being in America. And I was photographing my father and doing interviews in preparation for this project. And while he and I were talking, he mentioned to me that he no longer saw himself as Guyanese. My family immigrated here from Guyana, South America. And he said to me that he no longer saw himself as Guyanese, he saw himself as American. And that, for me, was a really fascinating declaration. And it started this conversation within me in terms of, like, what does it mean to become American? Like, what does that even look like? And is it possible? Next slide. So I kind of shifted a little bit, and my dad gifted me his very first passport photo when he was 16 years old. And I wanted to use the passport photo to kind of speak to the multiplicity of all these ideas of what is it, like that idea of becoming that is born of movement from one place to another. And you know, the passport photo, and Tina Kempt has spoken about this or written about this quite beautifully, but the passport photo is this image taken in the hopes of movement, in the hopes of future movement, in the hopes of future becoming, but there's also this underlying question of what's prompting that movement. And so for me, I started to kind of use the passport photo to start to think about some of these different things. Next slide, excuse me. So, you know, there was this question of how is in terms of the passport photo, it demands of us that we have to enact a certain state of stoicism, and that it represents a layer of neutrality that is such a lie, in my opinion. And so for me, within that stoicism, within that neutrality, or the proposed neutrality of the passport photo, for me, I was really interested in what is hidden in that, what is secluded, what is erased in that. And so I decided to think about the passport photo. Next slide. So I created a series. I took my dad's first passport photo, and I think initially I made like 50 copies. And for each one, I wanted to rethink or try to unearth these kind of latent things that are kind of inside the passport photo that's housed in it, inherently housed in it. You know, there's also this idea of, you know, this idea of subjecthood that is also linked to the passport photo, and these ideas of territory and borders, and what are the laws that are part of those territories, part of those nation states, and how does that impact the body? And all of that also is inside of that passport photo. And so, but it's latent. So for me, I wanted to kind of think of ways in which to bring that out. And thinking about repetition as practice, too. So for each passport photo, in some cases, I was using paint. Next slide. In other cases, I wanted to think about the story of what it was like for my father to move from Guyana to America. One of the first questions I asked him was, why America? Of all the places, like, why America? And without hesitation, his answer was the movies. And my dad, and I feel like a lot of Caribbeans of that particular generation loved Sidney Poitier. They looked up to Sidney Poitier as this kind of icon of what it means to transgress and to make it. So while I was doing work for this series, I was going out and just kind of looking for materials, and I went inside this novelty store, and they had a puzzle of all of Sidney Poitier's most famous roles. And I found this puzzle piece of Sidney Poitier and used that against my dad's image. And one of my favorite things is it doesn't quite fit but anyway. So the next slide. So in some cases, I'm using hair and beads. Next slide. In other cases, even thinking about alternate spatialities and alternate ways of becoming or alternate futures. In some cases, I'm thinking about, what would an alternate future look like for my father? So in this particular case, I was kind of imagining like what it would have been like if he had become a sea creature, a sea god. Next slide. But also thinking about the social, economic histories that are embedded in the slide, embedded into the to the passport as well. So thinking about what is the effects of slavery as also kind of this component of again, movement, and where does that movement, what prompts that movement, and is that movement given do you have a choice in that movement? Next slide. My dad is a superhero. Next slide. And the other aspect of it, my dad came to the States in 1967, and this is at the height of the civil rights movement within America. And so there's this idea of again, the histories that you carry, but also what is it like to be embedded, and like what does it mean to carry these histories and now become embedded and become a black man or seen as a black man in America. So this image I found from, it's a famous image of John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the 1968 Mexico Olympics, when they did this incredibly transgressive gesture of just holding their fists in the air as a sign of Black power. So I wanted to use that against my dad's image as well. Next slide. And there's also this idea of the marriage between my identity and my dad's, and the implications of him coming to America and how that's informed my my connection, my ideas around America, and also my link back to Guyana. And so in some of the images, there's a marriage between my identity and my dad's, and there's an aspect of gender bending in that as well. Next slide. So there's thinking about collage. Collage, I think inherently, there's something inherently disruptive to collage, and collage creates these states where you can reform, create narratives, reconfigure. So in some cases, I'm creating narratives of my dad's experience coming to America. Next slide. And in other states, I'm kind of creating new introductions of his body through collage. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. My parents were also huge supporters of Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey, who spearheaded the Pan-Africanist movement, and also being part of the Black Star line. I grew up with a huge poster of Marcus Garvey in my apartment. I thought Marcus Garvey was one of my relatives before I knew who Marcus Garvey was. So I wanted to bring, that the colors of the red, black, and green, and also the star, the Black Star, to the passport photo as well. Next slide. Next slide. And so with this series, and it's now become part of like my daily practice. The passports, or the number of repetitions, have ballooned to close to 300. So every day I'm kind of thinking of I keep coming back to this idea of becoming, and what does that look like? And a lot of it is informed by conversations with my father. So the series itself is now becoming this kind of this long-term conversation of what is the immigrant experience, and more specifically the Afro-Caribbean immigrant experience. Next slide. So in my new book, I'm thinking about collage a little bit differently in the new book. Next slide. And I'm thinking about how can collage disrupt existing ideas around temporality and existing ideas around timeline. And I do, personally, I do think that there is something inherently oppressive about how time is taught to us. So in the new book, I'm thinking about ways in which collage can open up a new timeline where the ancestral time and my existing time are kind of married together. Next slide. So here's an image of my grandmother's eye against an image of Big Daddy Kane. And just kind of wanting those two experiences, my lived experiences, to be part of the same image. That's it. That's last. I think that's last.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keisha, and amazing to see all of the new collage works. There's some I haven't seen before. They're so exquisite. Can't wait to see them come together in a book. So, yes. I loved what you also said about the idea of a timeline, how the ancestral timeline and the existing timeline comes together here. And I think in all of your work, there's that sense where past, present, and future sort of dialogue and cross-pollinate each other in a way. And I think what I feel like all of you are doing in your work, and especially also in those passport photographs that you've just shown, and the collage works, the reworking of them, is a sense of imagining otherwise. And I love that notion of just imagining another space, opening up new and different ways of seeing and creating new kinds of knowledges. But what I would love to do, we don't have a lot of time left, is just to go back to, with the three of you, to that space of pleasure. So you were just saying it's a daily practice, Keisha, to think about these collage works and continue to making them. We spoke about the repetitive return, that sense of coming back and that sense of re-embracing the work. Where does the pleasure sit, and how does that space of visual pleasure manifest for you, and the impulse of collaging and making that work? And also the liberatory. There's something very liberating in that. It's a call for freedom to me. All of it is an embracing of freedom. And I would love for all of you to just briefly speak to the idea of freedom, pleasure, and survival, even if just a couple of words of a stream of consciousness, if we can.
Going first? Okay. So yeah, it is part of a daily practice, and I think that I think the pleasure comes from pushing back against erasure. I think that's where the pleasure comes for me, and there's an amplifying, wanting to amplify narratives that I didn't see or experience when I was growing up, or even in my own education in terms of photography, being taught photography. So there is something, I think, in terms of my own pleasure, but also wanting to kind of bring that pleasure and that sense of beauty to the work that I do. And I think it becomes this thing of like a resistance of erasure is what comes up for me.
Sarah?
I was just going to say that I don't think there can be pleasure without pain. I think they're similar. I think there's pleasure, visual pleasure in the making of a print for me, and the actual, I see that in your work as well, and in your work, the pleasure of making a print for me is in the darkroom, the ritual of it, the alchemy of it, being in the darkroom, teaching students then how to print is a magical, pleasurable experience. But I would say that the making of my work also involves engaging with pain and difficulty and trauma and thinking about how do you make work from that stuff? How do you engage with it in a way that is ethical and that is not harmful to oneself? So I think there's a double kind of, I mean, you're asking about pleasure, but it's also about pain.
Absolutely.
So,
and is there a liberatory sense to it? Because the pleasure, the survival, and the liberation are very much connected, because working through trauma or ancestral trauma, there's a sense of liberation and survival that makes it necessary to create a space.
I was thinking about these questions before we came here today, because I knew this was the theme, and I was thinking about liberation in particular, and this is maybe to your point, Tara, too, this kind of how difficult it is to be free. So like we're about to have a US election, and I'm thinking about how 53% of white women vote for Trump, right? He's about to go up again. So it's this question of how for white women do not want to rock the boat, or how they soldier up, or this thing about indoctrination that is actually against their interest, is against is not. So it's these interesting contradictions of how, and I mean, there's that Baldwin quote about freedom, but it is so difficult, it's so painful to have pleasure, to have freedom, to make a better world. It is against comfort in a way. It's uncomfortable. So there's something really important, I think, about that. And
But do you think that the very act of collaging is also, there's a space actually where that sense of making, that sense of touching, where one feels that you can actually create a different sense of equity or justice through that, that daily struggle for freedom in a way? I feel like there is a...
Yeah, no, for sure. I was thinking especially with, I spent a lot of time with Friedlander's nudes, and this question of whether or not there was a way to queer this male gaze, or a way of thinking about being able to picture women's bodies without objectifying or exploiting the women's bodies, and how could it be self-pleasuring, So Carla Williams wrote this amazing essay in the Deb Willis Picturing Us book about this 1950s pornographic daguerreotype where the woman is pleasuring herself, and she writes about it as an act of empowerment, because how many pictures of black women are shown where they are the makers of their own pleasure, even if it's staged. Just to imagine that is really already something.
Yeah, and to reclaim it as an actual action. Because that's the other thing, that sense of action and the affirmative acts, and that's what I see
in my work, I'm often using the cable release, and I think I use it so often because it's a symbol of power. I feel like it's just taking control and having that power. I think that's really related, yeah.
Want to add anything, Keisha? Otherwise, I think I'm going to open to the floor, but happy to... No? Yeah, shall we take some questions? Okay, we've got probably about 5 to 10 minutes left, Fiona? Okay, are there any questions? Yes. Would you mind just briefly saying your name and keeping the question brief, please? Thank you.
Talk loud. Anne Sheldon.
Charlton.
I have a question. Actually, all your presentations are wonderful, so thank you so much. Particularly, I have a question for Justine about the legacy of Valerie Solanas, who obviously, we're just talking a moment ago about the trauma of collective histories and feminisms, and of course, Valerie died a pauper. And her work had a particularly militant edge, which you've picked up on in your book. And I wondered if you could just talk about that legacy and how you feel the book engages with it. and about her as a figure now for you, and maybe the meaning of that.
Well, thank you. I don't know if you guys know who Valerie Solanas is, but she was the very first radical feminist text. Scum Manifesto is a satire, and probably Valerie Solanas is most famous actually for shooting Andy Warhol. But she didn't shoot Andy Warhol because he was a man. She shot him because he stole the typescript of a play called Up Your Ass. And it's, you know, it's Valerie was very traumatized. Like the world made her psychotic. She was hospitalized when and her uterus was cut out of her. She was raped by her father. Her children were taken away from her. I mean, it's mind-boggling what she went through. And I think that I don't know, I find it very inspiring that she took, it's kind of what Tara is talking about. She took all of that trauma in her body and she pushed it outward. There's a lot of anger there, you know? And so I think about anger, and I wanted to be angry at all those books that I'd like, you know, were like oppressing me somehow. Like sometimes I walk through Paris Photo and I look at some of the booths and I feel really oppressed by what I see, and I want to cut up that work. But actually, there's something transformative about making, where actually the surprise of that work was the pleasure again of wanting to make something beautiful, because that's, I think, a really human impulse to want to see it and look at things that are beautiful. But yeah, thank you.
Any other questions in the audience? No hands? No questions? Okay. There's one last thing I would love to talk to you.
I have one more if there's time.
Yes, if it is about collaging and specifically about the work, then yes, we can take it, I think.
I was going to ask about the reaction of the artists whose books you've cut up. Have you had any interesting reactions to this act of collage?
Let's chat afterwards, because I want to hold some space for Tara and Keisha.
We've got like 3 or 4 minutes left, and I think one of the things I wanted to just maybe try and also speak about with you is that sense of the dialogue with the archive, the creating new and different histories, her stories, our stories, trans stories, their stories, all kinds of stories, in relation to that imagining otherwise. Keisha, would you say something towards that? You know, that sense of transforming value as well? I think there was in all of your presentations something around value and transformation crystallized really exquisitely.
Well, I mean, in thinking about archive, I think that there's something, there's inherent latency in archive. I think that there's what the image shows you in the moment, and then there's what's revealed years later or in the future. So I think that I think archive shows you different things at different times. So for me, when thinking about transforming and thinking about my dad's passport photo, for me, I'll be honest, like I think that what I'm doing is just showing what's inherently there. That was there the moment my dad took that picture at 16 years old. You know what I mean? So I think that that's, like for me, like when I think about archive and thinking about this idea of transformation, and sometimes I wonder, is it about transformation or is it just about revealing what's always been there? You know what I mean?
Because it's also you meeting your father's archive photograph in the present with your embodied lived experience. And similarly, Tara, with your work, the way you meet those poses and repost them and hold them in your body.
Yes, I think of my work as building a future archive of belonging. And that's what's hopeful about my work. It's building a future of belonging.
I love that, future of belonging. Justine, would you like to add anything, or should we go back to that question to finish if you want.
No, I'm going to talk to Anne later. We're going to have a little date.
Okay, but you know what you could say, though, in response to that? There's something about generosity, which is kind of where we began this conversation, around through the prism of generosity. And I think you all work through that notion of care and generosity. And I think you offered the collages back to some of the men whose work you've cut up.
It's true.
So there's something interesting, actually, that brings this question back to a closing point, in a way, around generosity.
Yeah. Well, you know, offering it to the men is like an olive branch, you know, because it is the way that we move forward, is to make space for each other. Otherwise, photography is in a mausoleum, and that doesn't do anything for anyone. No one wants to visit dead photographs. So it is about imagining the future.
Yeah. Because you're breathing life into them. That's actually what you're all doing. You're creating space for breath and breathing life into, and that's that sense of remediality as well, which is, you know, imagining another future, as you said, an archive of belonging in the future, of futurity. And I think it allows that sense of imagining otherwise and seeing differently. And I love.
No, I mean, I was just thinking that, I mean, coming back to this, like breathing life, and I think this idea of visual pleasure, I think that it's all kind of tied together in terms of like, how do you affirm that you're here and that you exist and that we're creating and making something that the future can hold. You know what I mean? I think is what is at the core of pleasure is affirming your existence.
Lovely. We are at the end of our session. All I can do is thank you so much for your brilliance, the gift of your work and your mind visually and otherwise. I'm so grateful, and it's been a real pleasure and privilege to share this space with you. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona and audience.
I just wanted to say Tara's new work is on display at Thomas Zander Gallery, and Keisha has her book signing tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Mac Books. And Justine has one today at 4:30. Is that off print? No, Mac, of course. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Renee, for pointing out this idea about lived experience, because that's exactly what the LX Paris Photo selection is looking at this year. I failed to say that at the beginning of the talk, but that's what it's about. Oh yes, and I'm sorry about the little glitchy issues. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for your wonderful work. Thank you, Renee.